morning, I want everyone to turn on their prediction machines and expect an amazing episode. Our guest jumped from the River Cam to the future, the BBC future, and is now one of the top science writers on Earth. He knows why smart people make dumb mistakes. He helps you change the world by changing your mindset. And while he's no Bobby, he will soon be laying down the laws of connection. We'll talk placebos and nocebos because you see, bros, our guest covers it all. We're recording on Valentine's Day and you're about to fall in love with him. Please welcome our guest, David Robson. David,
thanks so much for having me. That was quite the introduction.
It was. I will say it was a challenge figuring out what to rhyme with placebos and nocebos. So
you nailed it.
You see those. Yeah. Well, it is great to see you. It is Valentine's Day. We're recording. I am wearing pink, so I'm in the mood. And like I said, I have fallen in love with your work. I've been just absolutely absorbing the expectation effect. It's truly, and I think for the listener, this may be the most important podcast we've done because of how seismically this can shift people's lives. So I'm excited to talk about it. To begin, though, we connected after I read an article of yours in the Wall Street Journal. We're going to talk about that at the end. This is all about if for people who have been on, you have these goals and aspirations, especially at the beginning of the year. What happens when you get a setback? So that's a little teaser for the end, but let's dive in starting with the expectation effect. Will you tell us, you are a science writer. So this is not and I'll let you finish, but this is not a hype up book or a motivational book. This is rooted in science, how your mindset can shape the life you actually experience. Will you give us some background on how you stumbled upon this and a little bit of the background on the book?
Right, yeah. I mean, so I think we all have this kind of intuition that our mindsets do have an amazing impact on our life. But the challenge is really to know kind of, when does that work and how can we apply it? And how can we avoid setting our expectations too high so that we're actually, we're still rational with our thinking. That's really the aim of the expectation effect. And, what I showed here is that the expectation effect is real and that our beliefs can create self-fulfilling prophecies through changes to our behavior, to our perception, and to our physiology. So, it's very much a well-studied, very robust phenomenon. Like you said, it's grounded in science. And I first came across this idea when I was working at the BBC and researching a piece on the placebo effect and its evil twin, the nocebo effect, which you mentioned. So that, like the placebo effect is if you have positive expectations that a medical treatment will work, often the outcomes are better. Well, the nocebo effect is just the opposite. If you expect to become ill, often you experience the symptoms of that sickness. So it could be headaches, nausea, muscle pain, all of these complaints that we might have that could be side effects of drugs, or it could be, an expectation of sickness after your friends have all fallen ill after eating out at the same restaurant. So I was writing this piece. At the same time, I was going through quite a difficult period in my own life. I started taking some antidepressant pills. My doctor warned me, as they're obliged to do, that some of the side effects of those pills could be having really bad headaches. And, the first day I took them, and for about a week afterwards, I was having these migraines that made it very difficult for me to work. But by writing this book about this article about the nocebo effect, I did start to consider whether it was actually my expectations that were causing those symptoms. So I went into the scientific literature and I found that actually for this particular brand of antidepressant pills, what you find is that, people do report headaches, but in the clinical trials, people were also reporting headaches even when they were taking the dummy placebo pills. It seemed to be that for the vast majority of people, like more than 90% of people, the headaches were actually the result of expectations. And that didn't mean they were imaginary. Like I certainly felt a lot of pain. It felt no different from any other headaches I've had in my life. And that's because what we can see is that actually through this nocebo effect, there is a physiological change to your brain. You're actually, your expectations are causing the brain to become extra sensitive to pain, and it's doing things like changing the vasculature of the blood vessels within the brain that can actually contribute to the feeling um, of the migraine. So, it's very real, but it didn't have a purely biological origin. It wasn't because of some kind of chemical reaction with the pills I was taking. Um, and so, with that realization, I kind of opened my mind up to the possibility that this pain might just go away naturally if I kind of stopped focusing on it so much. And, within a few hours, it had actually disappeared. And that really just made me think, like, how powerful our expectations could be. And so I kept on gathering all of these papers that I came across. And over a few years, I had like a huge document that seemed to divide itself very neatly into these 10 separate chapters. And that was when I really thought, I want to tell this story. I want to share what I've learned with a bigger audience.
And it's by the way, it's anybody listening, I'm sure at this point is slightly skeptical, because that doesn't, what you just described with the migraines, that doesn't seem possible. But you go through in the book, and it's extraordinarily well researched, and I think you have about 40 pages of notes and citations at the end, so no one's going to accuse you of plagiarism at the end of this, which is good. So you could be the Harvard president as a result of this. So you do cite things so very clearly, but it's study after study after study of scientific research documenting this exact thing. And you said something a second ago, I want to make sure I heard that right. Did you say that 90% of people, even on the placebo in the headache study, 90% of people reported headaches just by knowing that there was a possibility of headaches? Did I hear that correctly?
I think that's kind of what I said, but I think the meaning wasn't quite clear. So I think
Okay,
90% of the people. So you might have like 9 people in the placebo trial, who, for every 9 people in the placebo trial, you would have who reported headaches, you would have 10 people in the taking the real drug. So it suggests that of those 10 people, 90% were suffering the nocebo effect, not a direct chemical effect of the drug.
So how is this, just the dummy question? How on earth is that possible? How is it that what we expect, what we anticipate, actually manifests physiologically?
I mean, it does seem miraculous. And so, first of all, I'd say I'm not claiming that you can do anything with your mind to your body.
Right.
It's not like,
right.
like there's, had been some kind of claims that, you can cure cancer just by kind of visualizing the tumor shrinking. Like, that is not what I'm claiming at all. Because in my opinion, there's no like plausible biological mechanism by which that could occur. But just because those kind of miracles don't happen doesn't mean that lots of amazing things can't be controlled by the mind. And so what we know is that our mindset is really important in preparing the body for the challenges ahead. That's actually kind of how the brain evolved, was to be kind of preemptive. That's why it's called a prediction machine, because it's one of the fundamental roles that it plays in its processing is to build simulations of the world and then to kind of guess what's coming next. So from those simulations, from those guesses of what's going to happen to us, the brain is helping to calibrate things like your hormonal balance, like the precise level of cortisol, the stress hormone, or adrenaline that you'll be experiencing. It's doing things like through the actions of the nervous system and then the immune system. It's doing things like shaping the amount of inflammation you might have in your body at any one time, preparing you for illness. It's changing the actions of the digestive system. We've all experienced that. If you start thinking about your favorite food, you might find that your stomach starts rumbling and your mouth starts watering. That's just releasing is beginning to release the digestive enzymes that will help you to derive the nutrients from that food. So I don't think any of this is magical. We experience it all the time. The expectation effect is more about how, looking at specific scenarios in which we might not have considered how the prediction machine could be influencing outcomes, and then learning how we can shape our mindsets to make the most of those effects.
And this is a different take on placebo than I had ever heard, because I think all of us think like, okay, a placebo is you're being tricked into believing you're taking something. But what you talk about is even knowing it's a placebo, it still has equal effect. Did I get that right? And will you explain that, how we can again, how you can even know that it's a placebo, but it can still have a similar effect to the actual medicine?
Right. I mean, so there's lots of ways that this might happen. One is that just um, like there's a kind of medical ritual and kind of being given the pill and taking it that feels quite reassuring. And that reassurance can itself have a biological impact. So it can do things like trigger the release of endorphins. It can reduce the release of these neurotransmitters, one of which is called CCK, that amplify pain signaling, because it's telling you that you're kind of being cared for and that you're in, you know, that it's like your body can kind of reduce some of its natural defenses because you're now receiving support from a medical professional or from your community. So that is one way that it could kind of immediately improve some of your symptoms, including the pain that you're feeling, potentially even things like inflammation, of a wound. Then there's another mechanism which is called conditioning. And that is where the body, through this prediction machine, through the brain's processing, starts to associate a certain outcome with a certain pill. So if you're receiving an opioid drug, the brain actually starts to produce its own opioids to kind of amplify the effect of that drug.
Wow.
And so then if you receive the pill, it kind of just triggers that, a bit like Pavlov's bells with the dogs. It just kind of triggers the same response. And so actually, if you take away the pill and just give a dummy pill, that kind of non-conscious conditioning is coming into play. And we can amplify that with these open label placebos by doing things like associating the real pain killing drug with a particular smell. So I think in one study it was this very strong smell of cardamom that these people had to kind of sniff as they took their opioid drugs. Then they took the real drugs away, they took the placebo pill and sniffed this really strong cardamom smell. And then, sure enough, they did start to experience almost the same level of pain relief. So there are lots of ways that we can use the placebo effect without it being deceptive. And actually, it's really encouraging for ways to kind of wean people off of those addictive drugs, is to actually try to use this to slowly kind of get them off their pills and to kind of empower them to realize that they can actually often manage their pain themselves through psychological techniques.
Yeah. The thing I like about how you wrote the book is you began with the physical manifestations of the prediction machine, of your expectations, but for most of us, it really is the life we experience. It's our experience of life is more. It takes up a lot more time than our physical ailments and pains, and so you transition this really into really how we experience life beyond this. And I read this book. I'm a dad of a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. I read this book as a parenting book because it made me think about what are the ways that I am living and experiencing things. And this is really hard because it's what are the subtle, closely held beliefs that I have that may be manifesting themselves negatively, and what are those other things? What are the things that I could really double down in showing this to my kids and helping them build good expectations and high expectations. And some of this is counterintuitive. When you talk about the nocebo effect, you talk about this, almost like when the doctor says, hey, this shot's going to hurt. It feels like it's bracing you to make the pain better, but it actually makes the pain worse versus just preparing you for something good. So within the nocebo, you talk about, and I love this, and I think so many people, especially parents, really go through this and experience this, is catastrophizing thoughts. Will you talk about that concept in and of itself, catastrophizing thoughts, and maybe how that could play out, and then ways that we could reset our expectations and then maybe the results of doing that when it comes to catastrophizing thoughts?
Yeah, I think like the idea of catastrophizing is kind of really at the heart of a lot of the expectation effects, and it's but it is like it creates a negative expectation effect. And that is just when we get into those negative loops of thinking where you're you're not just acknowledging the discomfort that you're feeling in the moment, but you're also then building these ever kind of escalating scenarios of what might happen in the future.
Yeah.
And you're often doing it with these not very nuanced, very uh, like you can talk to yourself with absolute confidence about these terrible things that you think are going to happen. So with
Right.
pain, it will be like, I just cannot cope with the pain. I will never get better. There
Mm.
must be something seriously wrong with me if I'm feeling this kind of pain. I'm going to die. All of these things. Even if you
Yeah.
don't have the evidence behind that, you just go down this kind of really, really like upsetting route of thinking, and you ruminate on those excessively.
Mm.
Now, what the research shows is that makes the pain itself a lot worse. So it actually
Mm.
increases the expression of that pain amplifying neurotransmitter, CCK. One of the researchers mentioned in her papers that it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It's actually just increasing the pain and all of its consequences so much worse, at a physiological level. Um, Now, I think like you know, if you're trying to apply the expectation effect to help yourself, like what you don't have to do is, you've like badly injured yourself and you're telling yourself, no, no, it's fine, it's fine. I'm just going to pretend I haven't been hurt. Like there's no point in deceiving yourself.
Right.
But you can try to ask yourself if there's kind of the evidence behind those
Mm.
catastrophizing thoughts that you're kind of just whether you're basically questioning whether your assumptions are correct. So you might start to think like, I'm never going to get better from this pain, it's never going to go away. Well, you can ask yourself, like, in the past, have I felt similar levels of pain? Like maybe you're in the middle of a migraine. Have you had a terrible migraine and then has it vanished, hours or days later? Like that it is kind of finite and that it can get better eventually, and just reminding yourself of that can help to break that negative cycle. Similarly, you can remind yourself that actually, often the amount of pain you're feeling is not always related to the severity of the injury. And your pain is actually there as a signal that's trying to protect you. It's trying to get
Mm.
you to safety and make sure that you don't exacerbate the injury. So if you tell yourself, I'm listening to that signal, I'm now in safety, I'm now protecting myself, so I don't have to keep on feeling that same level of pain. Well, that's another way of reducing this kind of catastrophizing thought that you're inevitably going to
Mm.
kind of deteriorate, and that can be very beneficial too. So that's really what I mean about
Yeah.
breaking this kind of vicious cycle of catastrophization. There's a lot of research behind this, looking at short-term pain and long-term chronic pain. It can be really beneficial for people who undergo cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic pain, to really be able to pin down what their particular flavor of catastrophization is, and to
Mm.
find useful ways to kind of break those thoughts. And that has a real impact on the symptoms they feel.
Do you think that parents are really I've noticed this. It feels like this is a very easy thing to perpetuate, even just with the way we talk about ourselves in front of our kids. Do you think that this is, do you think as parents, maybe let me ask it this way, what control do you believe we have as parents from a very young age with our kids about the way we talk about situations and catastrophize? Do you think that that's something that you observe in parents doing, and then it just kind of continues that cycle on with the next generation?
Yeah, absolutely. Because kids kind of internalize the dialogues that they might have had with their parents. And,
Mm.
I've experienced this myself. Like my mum, I think, did have a tendency to catastrophize. And then it was, took me a while to kind of break that cycle myself. But there's also a huge amount of research examining this. And so you can look at, you know, children who've gone through traumatic experiences. Like it could have been a car crash, it could have been an injury at school, a house fire, and you can psychologists have kind of, you know, they've spoken to these families like as soon as the accident happened, and then followed their
Mm.
progress later on. And what they found was that parents who really catastrophized a lot, if they were kind of telling their children and the researchers things like, oh, my son, he's never going to be the same again
Mm.
after this. And if they kind of adopt this avoidant kind of attitude where they're like, well, you fell out of that tree, you're never going to climb a tree again because it's
Mm.
so dangerous. That actually perpetuates the fears, and those kids are actually much more likely to develop the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder 6 months down the line compared to parents who might have taken a more nuanced kind of view to the event. So then they're not denying the fact that
Sure.
it was scary, that the child was hurt, but they also try to focus on other elements too, like the
Mm-hmm.
fact that it might be a very rare event that is not likely to happen again, the fact that there were first responders who uh, came and supported them immediately, the kindness of the people in the hospitals, all of these kinds of things can just help the child to process the event in a more balanced way, and then that is
Mm.
protective against the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we can see the same even with very small things like a kid having their tonsils taken out. If a kid, if the parents catastrophize the pain, that kid actually remembers it as being a far more traumatic experience
Mm.
than if the parents just help to shift their attention to some of the other elements of the experience beside the fear and the discomfort.
One of our favorite parenting experts is Dr. Becky, and she talks about how it's not necessarily the memory itself; it's the memory of the memory is the thing that
Yeah.
continues to perpetuate. And exactly what you're saying. It's such a brilliant way to put it. And just this is just a note for the listener, really a note for myself. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about all the ways that I've done this poorly in the last 15 years of being a parent. But you talk about this a lot, and we'll get to this in a little bit. But this is just a note for right now, to have some self-compassion, to recognize that in a similar way here, you could actually catastrophize this in trying to avoid catastrophizing thing. You could catastrophize this instance and just say, "Oh, I've messed this up so much. Gosh, I've really wounded my kids," as opposed to saying, "Hey, I've missed this a few times. What a cool opportunity to reset right now." So that's just a note for the listener. If you're feeling like I felt, I was starting to feel a little tinge of guilt, and I think it's important to just say, I can. This is okay to not go down a bad route there.
Yeah, no, I
And
100% agree with that. Yeah.
this ties into the mirror system that you talk about. The mirror system, where basically we take, and we'll use the example of kids, we take the physical and mental states of others around us, and we build that into our own simulation, how we experience life. People who are high in empathy kind of can do this because you feel other people's pains, and so it's almost like you take what others are experiencing and make it your own. Will you explain Will you explain the mirror system? And we've talked about it adjacently, and then I have a couple follow-up questions on that.
Yeah, so I mean, the mirror system is kind of one of the kind of brain systems that feeds into the kind of prediction machine, as I call it. It's helping you. It's just another way of using the information around you to kind of build those simulations of kind of what might be going on in your own body and how to deal with potential threats. So I think the obvious example in which this could have been very beneficial in evolution is, like I said earlier, if you've had a meal and then one of your acquaintances becomes very sick, you immediately, the sight of their kind of discomfort and their vomiting or whatever makes you feel nauseous, and it might, if you have that feeling strong enough, it might make you start to kind of throw up as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not pleasant, but the fact is that by doing that, you're actually ridding yourself of the potential pathogens that might have
Mm.
infected your friend, even if you don't actually have them in your own body. It's like a protective mechanism. Similarly, if loads of people are scratching themselves, it makes sense for you to start being extra sensitive to anything that could be a potential insect or bug that might be giving you an infection too, so you can avoid that danger. So that's how the mirror system worked in the past, but obviously then it does have implications today. And one of them is that it can contribute to these kind of cases of mass psychogenic illness, where you find that relatively large groups of people can all come down with the same symptoms, even if there's nothing actually threatening in their environment. So one of my favorite examples involved these school kids in Portugal who'd all been watching this teen soap opera called Strawberries and Sugar. And a kid there had this mystery illness that it was like some mystery virus that was making them faint and throw up and stuff. And then one day at school, I guess just one kid kind of started to manifest those symptoms, like maybe they're taking it a little bit too seriously. But all of their friends were also primed to start believing in this too. So it started spreading through not just a single school, but through multiple schools across the country. And like health experts, who unsurprisingly hadn't been watching the teen soap opera, were really perplexed, and they were looking for all kinds of biological explanations. Things like, could it be like poisonous caterpillars in the schoolyards, all of these kinds of things. But eventually it did become apparent that it was psychogenic. It was coming from this contagious nocebo effect. And that ultimately, all comes down to the mirror system that's kind of spreading those symptoms between people.
That's just amazing. And again, these are actual physical manifestations. It's not as if everybody got together and said, hey, we're all going to do this. It's just you begin to observe and you begin to create a reality around you, which makes me think again about taking it to the home. You actually talk about how important your social circle is, especially for kids too, who you're forming yourself around, because that's going to be your view of the world. And I think and again, I'll reference Dr. Becky again. Dr. Becky talks about the most generous interpretation. When you're in a relationship, when something happens with your kids or your spouse or your partner, you have to, okay, what's the most generous interpretation of this? Maybe they weren't actually being dismissive or rude. Maybe they had a rough day, and how can I help them through that? But in doing that, in having the most generous interpretation, you can create the world around you by being that outwardly, and people will begin to mirror that. So there's the negative side, again, the psychogenic illnesses, but isn't it true that you can also create that positive world around you by initiating that yourself?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is true. And I think that's what I love about this research, is that actually one of the research kind of shows that the best way to apply expectation effects to yourself is actually to share it with other people, because you kind of internalize what you say. It's called the saying is believing effect. So a lot of the interventions that they do in these studies is getting people to kind of write out short essays or social media posts about how they might apply, a certain mindset in their life. But then you are spreading it to another person who might spread that to another person, and that it can be contagious. And we see that with things like positive stress mindsets. So if you teach people about how feelings of anxiety in moderation can actually be very useful in achieving your goals, and actually it can be a form of kind of energy and motivation and a useful source of information. If you have one person in a team who's thinking like that, it often just spreads quite naturally to the other people around them. So we can all make a difference, not just to ourselves, but to the people we care about.
Which is how culture is formed, right? Which is how cultures are just the taken for granted assumptions with how a group operates, and so you can begin that in your whatever little subculture you have, whether it's a work subculture, whether it's a family subculture, whatever you're in, you can begin to shape that culture by normalizing that behavior. I think there's another tie, and you talked about the concept of upward comparisons. And again, as this being a parenting book, you think about, I immediately went to social media. For a developing child's brain, when they're looking at somebody else, they're looking at somebody who may be more fit than they are. And again, they talk about, obviously like the huge detriment to especially teenage girls' body image when they see others around them and they're comparing themselves up, and that just brings them way down. I would love your take. You reference it a little bit in the book. Will you give me a take on how you're seeing social media's impact on young developing children's brains when it comes to upward comparison?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think upward comparison is the major danger, which, it is, what do we call it? Like the thief of joy. Because there's always, no matter how good you are, there's always going to be someone who, for whatever reason, you think they've achieved a little bit more than you, they're more beautiful than you, they're smarter than you. You know, you're never going to be the kind of at the peak of humanity. So it's a losing game. Like if you're doing upward comparison, you're always going to feel bad about yourself. We know that can then produce these negative expectation effects. So people who look at Fitspiration posts on Instagram, these kind of incredibly sporty people, the idea is that kind of motivates you to kind of work out extra hard. But the research shows that actually, because you're kind of it's causing you to denigrate your own fitness, you actually find the exercise less pleasurable, it feels like harder work, and you don't get that kind of high once you've finished the exercise. So it's not really that inspiring at all, actually. It's very detrimental. And yeah, I think like this is something that can happen to all of us. I think there's loads of neuroscience showing that it's going to be especially likely for teenagers because as their brains are developing, they do some of the changes that are occurring during adolescence do mean that they feel emotions like shame, especially keenly, things like shame and humiliation. And there's a whole evolutionary theory about how actually, kind of building strong social relationships and like being aware of your status might have been useful during adolescence in evolutionary terms, because if you build strong alliances, then you're kind of set up well for adulthood. But obviously, like people living in caves didn't have Instagram where they could be looking at hundreds or thousands of profiles that would be constantly triggering that social comparison. So it is a danger, but I do think that social media can also be of benefit if we teach children to not engage with it in that way, because you can also use social media for social connection. Obviously, like it's a powerful tool for staying in touch with people, even if you no longer live near to them, for celebrating other people's successes, for talking about issues that might be affecting you. And I think that's why we often see in the scientific literature conflicting findings. Like you'll have one study that shows that social media use is, triggering a rise in depression in teens, and another that finds no such effect and finds that actually the more teens use social media, kind of the more well adjusted they are. And I think it's because both can be true. It can be detrimental, it can be good for the kids. They really need to have the kind of social media literacy to be aware of these effects and to be taught how to use it for the good of their own mental health, and how to notice when actually it's having a negative impact and when to disengage as well.
Yeah. It does show to your point, it seems like the downside is so severe. I think we're probably years away from legislation with young kids, but especially as they're young, this is what we hear from people who think about this a bunch is the holding off the longer you can, especially on social media for kids. That holding off, it almost has a similar effect to alcohol in a way. The likelihood of a kid becoming an alcoholic is directly proportional to the age at which they were exposed to alcohol. And so the more we can kind of, as our kids grow, like let social media grow with them to some degree, and then we can have a little bit more of a handle on it. But that developing mind, I mean, even to probably a lot of people listening to 30, 35-year-old moms and dads, it's hard ourselves to not get caught in that comparison trap. And I love how you called it the thief of joy, because that's exactly what it is, as opposed to looking at all the good that's happening around us.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And yeah, especially like you say, just waiting for the brain to kind of develop enough that I think that to get past that stage where you're so sensitive to other people's judgment, I think once the kind of prefrontal cortex starts maturing more in kind of late teens, early 20s, I think we can make more rational appraisals of these situations. But like you said, like if it starts very very young, I don't think kids are well equipped to deal with it in the most constructive way.
Yeah. There's a lot more in the book, and I don't want to go over all, because I do want people to go read this book. I texted this book as I was reading it to 8 or 9 friends, just said, you have to get this book. And this is, I want everybody out there to get this. This will shape how you view the world. Dave, you'll laugh. This morning I was doing a workout and I was in the middle of a terrible set of burpees. And I thought to myself, oh, think of what this is doing for my body. This fatigue is a good sign. That means I'm developing it. But it does. It changes. It actually changes the way you view the things that you're going through. And so that subtle mindset shift, or maybe it felt like a drastic mindset shift at the time, it is really, really helpful. The question I have, maybe for these purposes right here, for you yourself, or maybe your advice to others, there's a lot in here and awareness is the first step, but it seems like a lot to begin to try to apply. What are a couple of first steps for people to begin to apply the expectation effect to their lives?
Yeah, I mean, so, I guess like having written the book, like chapter by chapter, I did start applying all of the techniques myself. So I think you can integrate it into your kind of daily thinking in a way that actually comes to feel very natural. But yeah, I think like small steps is definitely the answer. I think just identifying those catastrophizing thoughts and then kind of trying to break those cycles just by questioning your assumptions and keeping an open mind. So just reminding yourself, like, this might be what I most fear, but it doesn't mean that it's definitely going to happen, that it could be much better than I expect to. I think that's a really positive way to start. Then I think maybe just look at one domain where you feel like you could make a real difference, where you have a real desire to try to apply this. So it could be something like fitness, or it could be stress about a situation that leaves you feeling very anxious. And then it's all about reappraising the feelings in just the way that you said. It's like we can see our feelings of fatigue as a kind of sign of failure when we're exercising. It's like it can be really frustrating. Like you want to be fitter than you are, and you feel like if the exertion is really hurting, then it's a reminder you haven't achieved that goal. But you can also spin that like you did and emphasize that actually is a sign of growth. Like you're never going to get better if you always go on like the slowest speed on the treadmill, or you kind of quite limply just go for a few burpees without kind of pushing yourself to the max. So it's a sign. The pain is a sign of growth. And the research shows that once you recognize that, you're actually more likely to feel that flood of endorphins that makes us feel so good after exercise. With something like stress, if something's making you feel anxious, just reminding yourself that actually, as uncomfortable as you might feel, the physical symptoms, things like the racing of your heart, that's not actually a bad or dangerous reaction. It can actually be very helpful because it's pumping all that oxygen to your brain. And when you feel kind of on edge, well, that cortisol, you might feel uncomfortable, but the cortisol is actually keeping you alert. And if you're going for a job interview, doing a presentation, whatever, you don't want to be kind of sleepy and drowsy. You want to be, energized and putting all of your attention into the task at hand. I've applied that myself, but in both of those cases, it was probably the first ways that I started to use the expectation effect, and it really felt like a very iterative process. So kind of straight away, I felt like there was a small benefit, like these, my workouts just got a little bit more pleasant. I started to enjoy public speaking a little bit more. And then you kind of build on that. So the next time that you face the same kind of task, you remind yourself of how you felt the last time. You reapply that cognitive appraisal. So you start kind of trying to reinterpret those sensations another time. And you'll see a positive trajectory. So you might not have a miracle, like you're not going to become an Olympic athlete overnight by changing your mindset. You're not going to become like this super charismatic speaker when you are a nervous wreck just by applying the expectation effect once. But over, relatively short periods of time, like, weeks or months or the course of a year, actually the change will feel quite miraculous. And I see it as just being a way of taking the brakes off of your progress. You've had these kind of self-sabotaging thoughts that you're now kind of reconstruing, and that is just helping you to make the most of all of the effort that you are putting into these challenges.
That's so good. And you said something there that's such, even if someone just walked away with these 7 words, when we're going through anything physical, mental, emotional, whatever it is, just this that simple line, the pain is a sign of growth. Just what if we just began today and just said, like, when we felt something that was uncomfortable, we said, oh, this pain is a sign of growth. And I think, and you say this in the epilogue, and I said it earlier, it's just to be kind to yourself. Like you said, it is an iterative process. For me, I got 43 years behind me that I have to rewire. And so let's do that slowly, right? Just that being kind to yourself is such an important principle. And I love how you tie that applicability to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, self-compassion, it's like, I'm almost like a evangelical about self-compassion because I feel like the research is so strong. It's something that it doesn't come naturally to most of us, but actually the research shows us that. So people assume that self-criticism is the way to get better, because you think, well, if I don't kind of really own my mistakes and beat myself up about them, I'll just kind of keep repeating it again and again. It's kind of like this kind of puritanical mindset almost. It's like, you need to kind of feel, it's like spared the rod, spoiled the child. Well, we apply it to ourselves. Actually, I hope none of us would do that with our children these days. And I hope, and we should start using the same philosophy with ourselves, because actually self-compassionate people are far more effective at bringing about personal change than self-critical people. Because with self-compassion, you start to feel more kind of more self-efficacy. You feel more capable. You procrastinate less because you're less stressed, and all of that's really important for then enacting your new goals.
This is just candidly, this is a good but difficult concept, because I'm overcoming a lot of years of you kind of link your actions to your identity versus peeling the two apart. That's a really important piece of just like, oh, I'm good inside, but I did something that maybe wasn't good. So this brings us to how we originally connected. Was your absolutely brilliant Wall Street Journal article. It was in January when it was written, in the time that people are setting resolutions and goals, and probably, my suspicion is, failing at some of those goals and resolutions they had. And the title of your article was "Don't Give Up Because You Slipped Up." And you talk about the setback effect. Will you walk us through that principle? And people, we'll actually link that article in the show notes as well, because it's so powerful. Will you walk us through that setback effect? And for the person right now who says, I had all these aspirations and I've already failed.
Right. I mean, I think this is has been a very common phenomenon where, you set a goal like to lose weight or to go to the gym or, to learn a language or whatever, to go to like your lessons, and then something gets in the way, like you're tempted by a piece of cake, or you've had a bad day at work and you just want to go and watch like trash TV rather than going to the gym, or your friends are going to the pub and so you skip your language lesson. And like all of that is valid, actually. Like, we don't have to be perfect to achieve our goals. Like, we don't have to be 100% like committed every single day of our life for cumulatively the positive steps we have taken to bring us towards our goal. It's only a minor detour, but we often don't see it like that. It's not logical, but when we fail once, we tell ourselves that there was something inherently wrong with our self-control and willpower. Like, we're just not the kind of person who's capable of resisting temptation and of committing. And like any expectation effect, that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we have a sense of lower self-efficacy, it makes it much harder for us to then stay committed the next time that there might be another temptation. And there's quite a few studies now showing that this happens in all kinds of situations. So when people are trying to stop procrastinating or trying to get fit, trying to lose weight, in all of these cases, the feeling of guilt and the blame that we put on ourselves is detrimental. And actually, just reminding ourselves of the fact that, lots of things come up in life that can temporarily weaken our willpower. That is fine. Like, we can try to avoid them, but when we fail, we just have to remind ourselves that it doesn't say anything kind of inherent about ourselves, and that actually you can pick up, the next day where you were, and all of the progress that you've made is still there and isn't wasted. That you can still just get, back on the wagon and continue without any lasting harm being done.
Again, in a way, it sounds like you're excusing yourself. That's how it feels on the surface. But when you do, again, you start the guilt just kind of pulls you down, or you start identifying yourself as somebody who can't follow through on their tasks versus saying like, no, I can do that. I had a quick lapse, or, hey, this is a difficult thing that I'm doing, which means of course there are going to be challenges. Of course there'll be setbacks, but it's this balance between completely excusing yourself, but then beating yourself up. It's just this little sweet spot right in the middle, right?
Right, exactly. And that, it comes back, like you were suggesting, to self-compassion. And that's what we find with people who are self-compassionate. It doesn't mean that they just dismiss any mistake that they've made, but they just realize that it doesn't reflect something inherently awful about themselves. And they recognize that there's actually a chance to make up for any errors that they've made. If you lost your temper with your kids, you can make up for that afterwards. You can apologize. You can kind of use it as a moment to kind of talk about, like processing difficult feelings or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to leave like a lasting stain on the relationship. It's the same with all of those other goals. You might realize that by just changing your routine slightly, it's going to be much easier for you to go to the gym if you work out in the morning rather than the evenings. Or, maybe you just need to move the cookie jar a bit further away from your desk where you're working. We can learn from our mistakes, and we can see self-control as this kind of skill that, increases with time. But like you said, like any skill, it needs practice. Sometimes we're going to be better than we are at other times, but you're just focusing on the trajectory. It's a journey, and you're trying to focus on like your end goal rather than getting too kind of caught up in those tiny little detours that you make.
I love that. We will link that article in the show notes. I've taken too much of your time, but will you tease out for us, coming June 4th, will you tease out for us The Laws of Connection, your upcoming book, which, by the way, we're going to have you back on before then, but just give us a little teaser on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to come back to chat. But yeah, The Laws of Connection, it's available for pre-order now. And it's really kind of following on from the expectation effect. You don't need to have read the expectation effect to enjoy it, but it's really building on some of those themes to look at our social relationships and how we have a bunch of psychological barriers that prevent us from connecting to the people around us in the most optimum way. So one example of this quickly is something called the liking gap, and that's where you can meet someone new, you can have a really enjoyable conversation where you really feel like you get each other, but afterwards both parties start doubting themselves. So they think, they know they liked the other person, but they assume the other person didn't like them as much. And both parties are feeling this. And, because of that, they are less likely to kind of make an effort to connect again in the future. It's completely wasted because actually, chances are both parties liked each other as much, as much as they did. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, I guess the book is just looking at all of these barriers and how to knock them down. And actually, like with the expectation effect, it's often just about reappraising what we're feeling, questioning our assumptions, just pushing ourselves to be a little bit braver and saying that actually, even with just a few changes to our behavior, we can really live a much more fulfilling, happy social life.
I love that. Be a little bit braver. David, I'll tell you one thing. I don't doubt that I like you, and I know that our guests, our audience,
Likewise.
doesn't doubt that doesn't doubt that they've liked you. And this has just been, man, this has been so good. And believe me, I've cut out a bunch of my notes and questions because I just engulfed myself in this book. So thank you for joining us. Where can people? You mentioned the pre-order of the Laws of Connection. Can people just go to your website? What's the best way to follow your work?
Yeah, I mean, to follow my work in general, like, please do come to my website. It's davidrobson.me. I update that with kind of book news, with new kind of media articles that I've been working on, and podcast appearances. To kind of pre-order or order any of my books, just use your kind of regular booksellers. So it could be Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble. They'll be available wherever you buy your books.
That's wonderful. David, thank you so much. It was great talking to you, and we look forward to having you back here to talk about the Laws of Connection in a couple of months.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation.